Mrs. Wingfield did talk the matter over with the overseer, and things went on in consequence more smoothly. Vincent, however, adhered to his wish, and it was arranged that as soon as he could get a nomination, he should go to West Point, which is to the American army what Sandhurst and Woolwich are to England. Before that could be done, however, a great political agitation sprang up. The slave states were greatly excited over the prospect of a Republican president being chosen, for the Republicans were to a great extent identified with the abolition movement, and public feeling, which had for some time run high, became intensified as the time approached for the election of a new president, and threats that if the Democrats were beaten and a Republican elected, the slave states would secede from the Union were freely indulged in. In Virginia, which was one of the most northern of the slave states, opinion was somewhat divided, there being a strong minority against any extreme measures being taken. Among Vincent's friends, however, who were for the most part the sons of planters, the Democratic feeling was very strongly in the ascendant, and their sympathies were wholly with the Southern states. That these had a right to secede was assumed by them as being unquestionable. But in point of fact, there was a great deal to be said on both sides. The states which first entered the Union in 1776 considered themselves to be separate and sovereign states, each possessing power and authority to manage its own affairs, and forming only a federation in order to construct a central power, and so to operate with more effect against the mother country. 2 years later, the Constitution of the United States was framed, each state giving up a certain portion of its authority, reserving its own self-government and whatever rights were not specifically resigned. No mention was made in the Constitution of the right of a state to secede from the Union, and, while those who insisted that each state had a right to secede if it chose to do so declared that this right was reserved, their opponents affirmed that such a case could never have been contemplated. Thus, the question of absolute right had never been settled, and it became purely one of force. Early in November 1860, it became known that the election of Mr. Lincoln, the Republican candidate, was assured, and on the 9th of that month, the representatives of South Carolina met at Charleston, and unanimously authorized the holding of a state convention to meet on the 3rd week in December. The announcement caused great excitement, for it was considered certain that the convention would pass a vote of secession, and thus bring the debated question to an issue. Although opinion in Virginia was less unanimous than in the more southern states, it was generally thought that she would imitate the example of South Carolina. On the day following the receipt of the news, Vincent, who had ridden over to the plantations of several of his friends to talk the matter over, was returning homeward, when he heard the sound of heavy blows with a whip and loud curses, and a moment later a shrill scream in a woman's voice rose in the air. Vincent checked his horse mechanically with an exclamation of anger. He knew all too well what was going on beyond the screen of shrubs that grew on the other side of the fence bordering the road. For a moment he hesitated, and then muttering, "What's the use?" was about to touch the horse with the whip and gallop on, when the shriek again rose louder and more agonizing than before. With a cry of rage, Vincent leapt from his horse, threw the reins over the top of the fence, climbed over it in a moment, and burst his way through the shrubbery. Close by, a negro was being held by 4 others, 2 having hold of each wrist and holding his arms extended to full length, while a white lad, some 2 years Vincent's senior, was showering blows with a heavy whip upon him. The slave's back was already covered with wheals, and the blood was flowing from several places. A few yards distant, a black girl with a baby in her arms was kneeling on the ground, screaming for mercy for the slave. Just as Vincent burst through the bushes, the young fellow, irritated at her cries, turned round and delivered a tremendous blow with the whip on her bare shoulders. This time no cry came from her lips, but the slave, who had stood immovable while the punishment was being inflicted upon him, made a desperate effort to break from the men who held him. He was unsuccessful, but before the whip could again fall on the woman's shoulders, Vincent sprang forward and, seizing it, wrested it from the hands of the striker. With an oath of fury and surprise at this sudden